It's 11 now. We have 60 minutes. I have tons of stuff that I'm excited to share. So we're going to pack a punch. Hopefully you'll get a lot of value from this. Anna is tuning in from home in Minneapolis. The self-awareness. Yes, one of my favorite topics. So let me just start with a little context and first just say thank you for coming. Twin City Startup Week is such a good event. I think this is probably my 4th year doing an event at Startup Week. It was first in person, and then the last 2 years I've done a virtual event. Ooh, let's see from Chris. You got your master's in cognitive science, read a ton of books on awareness and Buddhism and the differences in individual perceptual lenses. Curious to hear your approach. That's awesome. And yeah, I think it's so fascinating, all the different approaches and when you can kind of hear similar concepts with different language. So definitely excited to hear your input. And as we go along, feel free to type things into the chat. We will have some time for Q&A, but you can type questions throughout. And yeah, then we'll go from there. So first of all, just a little context. Who am I? Why am I talking on this topic? So I'm Meredith. I'm based in Minneapolis as well. And I have a business called Scaling Within. So to me, Scaling Within is all about expanding your internal capacity to sustain external growth. So a lot of people are really focused on scaling what they do, whether that's their revenue, their impact, etc. And I don't think you can really do that well externally without continually expanding that internal capacity, because it's one thing to have a great idea. It's a completely different thing to navigate team dynamics and deal with the endless complexities and challenges that happen along the way. Hey, Scott, I think I saw you on the list and was like, was that guy in my dorm building freshman year of college? I think that's you. Good to see you here. So my background, I'm a licensed therapist, and my specialty in that field was with complex trauma and PTSD, dealing with some of the most horrific, complex, traumatic situations you can imagine. About 4 years ago, I shut down my private practice and shifted gears. And this was my interest for doing that. It was seeing that whether it's the head of a family, a business, an organization, the issues at the top always flow down. They just always do, good or bad. So if you can have healthy, wholehearted people at the top of systems, it automatically flows into the cultures below. And that includes who's ever on a team or working for a company, but also whoever benefits from the product or service being delivered. So that was one of my interests in making this leap. And the other piece will really connect with the title here, Becoming a Waymaker. So my other interest in starting this business was really feeling this thing like, wow, I really think we're entering a transition of eras. And that sounds pretty intense, but I think after 2020, we can feel that on some level. And what I mean by that is a time in history where years from now, your kids and grandkids will read in the history books and look back and say, oh, the world was this way and it shifted. We're going through fundamental shifts. And if you were to break down society into these different spheres, these different domains like arts and entertainment, business, education, government, family, religion, media, all these different sections of society, we're seeing them all kind of bursting at the seams and coming to a head. Like the container that structures have been aren't the way that they're going to be going forward. And I don't know how that's all going to play out, but we're kind of in the midst of this transition. Just as an example, education. The way that the education system has been for a long time isn't necessarily the way we'll see it long term. It's kind of busting at the seams. Paying tons of money for a college degree that gets you lots of debt and doesn't set you ahead at all, versus being able to buy on demand the information that you need from a subject matter expert in the moment. Like these things are just shifting. So with that idea in mind, when you're in a transition of eras, it's really the perfect grounds for innovation, for pioneering, for solving new problems and solutions. And I hope I'm on some level preaching to the choir in the Startup Week. Because on some level, if you are drawn to this title of becoming a waymaker, whether it's that or the self-awareness piece, I'm hoping that this will speak to you on some level. So whether you relate to that or you're part of a team that's like that. And I want to just explain what I mean a little bit by waymaker. So I'm going to draw on this handy dandy whiteboard. I draw a lot of triangles here. But let's say that this is a mountain, and this represents like you going for it in life, like what you're capable of. And often we find that there's a lot of people that hang around the base of a mountain. It's not good or bad, right or wrong, but there's a lot of people down here. But not as many people make the trek up. And when you're a waymaker, it means you're one who makes a way. You're a pioneer. You're the one taking the machete to the jungle and clearing a path. So I also see this like you're like the tip of the spear. You're the one like going through the blood, the sweat, and the tears to carve out something, to go ahead. Visionaries see something what can be. They see the potential for something that not everyone else is ready for yet. But when that's the case, it's a lonely place. Like there's a lot of people down here, not as many people make that trek up. The air is thinner. It's just different. If you can relate to this, let me know in the chat. You're the one facing all the flack, but here's the thing. As you carve this path, you actually make a way for many others behind you. So it's very worth it. It's just not an easy journey. And so that's a huge passion of mine, is to speak to those that have that in them, to pioneer, to build, and to create, and move the world forward in some way or another. But because it's lonely, that not as many people do it, it's often misunderstood. What you really have to do is look across peaks to find other people that are doing that in their own realm, on their own mountain, and you also need a space and place to be poured into. So that was really my personal interest and motivation for building out Scaling Within, working with founders, CEOs, and doing programs. I'll mention maybe a little bit of that end, but I just want to give you that context for this topic. So on that note, this is true for every human right now, but especially when you're pioneering, when you're waymaking, there are no feedback loops. It's not the same as going from college and then going into corporate and just having all these systems and this understanding of how things work. You're really out there figuring it out. And so it's really vital that we grow in self-awareness. So to me, self-awareness is the foundation to be able to scale within, to be able to grow on the inside. Because if I don't grow in awareness, I will ensure that I act out of old patterns. If I don't have awareness, I ensure that I react out of the ways that always have been, whether that's in my culture, whether that's what I saw patterned in my family that I grew up in. It's almost like if you've ever seen those toy train tracks, they're kind of like wooden puzzle pieces, and it makes a circle and you go round and round. Without self-awareness, we just go around the same path again and again. As we grow in self-awareness, it's almost like, I don't know what these are called, but those little Y pieces where you actually have the chance to pivot and form a new way forward. So with that being said, I'm really excited to teach you about my most favorite thing to talk on. And this is a framework that comes from the field of neurobiology. I learned this in the trauma therapy field. And once I learned this, I was like, this is gold. Like every human should know this. So this is one of these theories, like once you learn it, you can't unsee it, and it will forever shift the way that you conceptualize yourself, your relationships. This will be helpful if you're married, in your personal relationships, with coworkers, anybody. So really excited to teach about that. So here we go. Okay, so this is the framework we're going to cover today, and it's called the window of tolerance. So tolerance is a word we hear a lot. It can mean different things in different contexts. In this context, tolerance is about your ability to stay present and tolerate a given situation without flying out of your window, which I'll explain more here in a second. So we all have a window. When you're in your window, you're connected to what therapists would say is the wisest, kindest part of who you are. It's the part of you that can see the forest from the trees, like you have that higher perspective. You're grounded and calm and centered. You can access both your emotions and logic and reason at the same time. Usually, if I do this workshop for a company and we have more time, I ask people a question at the beginning. So I'll ask it and you can think of it on your own. But I have people think of a time when they felt fully alive and fully themselves. A lot of times for people, it's a time in nature on top of a mountain or on a beach somewhere, or some time where they were performing maybe in athletics or something like that. But typically, if you think about a time when you felt fully alive, that's for sure a time when you were in your window. It's a time when you're fully present. You're not thinking about your to-do list. You're not anxious about the future. You're in the present. When you're in your window, a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex is online. So we don't get the prefrontal cortex until around 26 on average. To me, this is fascinating because just think about, in hindsight, how many major life decisions we often make before we have our brain fully developed. There's a lot of far-reaching implications there. So when we have that higher brain, it's the part of us that can think abstractly, that can see from above, as opposed to kids are super literal and concrete in their thinking. So let's say there's a little boy and his dad is verbally abusive to him, and he says, "You good for nothing idiot, you'll never amount to anything." That little boy doesn't have higher perspective yet. He doesn't have the ability to go, "Oh, my dad just had a bad day at work and he's taking it out on me," or "His father treated him poorly and he doesn't know better." Little kids don't have that abstract understanding. Instead, they just absorb the emotion of it like a sponge, and it gets stored in emotional memory and body memory, but it's not connected to their higher cognition yet. So all of us, even if you had the best childhood, we all have little developmental wounds or triggers or insecurities or rejections that got imprinted before our higher brain was online. And so what that can mean is we have that wounding go in place, and then we go about our business, we move on with our life, we become fully capable professional adults most of the time until something takes us out of our window. When we fly out of our window, our higher brain shuts down, and we're literally seeing the present moment through the neurology in our brain of a younger wounded state. So your adult self can manage and handle complex adult situations, but an 8-year-old part of you that's insecure or was wounded or made fun of, if that part is running the show, it doesn't have what it takes. So if you've ever experienced this yourself, or let's just say you haven't, but you know other people in your life where sometimes it's like you're interacting with, again, a capable professional adult, and then in a different instance, it feels like you're dealing with a teenager or a kid. Typically what has happened is they have gotten triggered and flown out of their window. So let me explain what happens when you fly out of your window. So we all can go out of our window in one of two directions. If you go out the top of your window, you go into what's known as a state of hyper-arousal. So hyper-arousal is more of an anxiety type of sensation. When you get fast-beating heart, a panicky feeling, something called catastrophic thinking, that's when your thoughts fly from 0 to 100. And as I'm explaining this, if any of you have ever experienced this or can relate, let me know in the chat. I'm sure probably none of you have ever experienced catastrophic thinking before. But when we're in this state of hyperarousal, we're actually in a fight or flight mode. Our higher brain is shut down, and we're seeing the moment through fight or flight. So if I'm walking down the street and someone is threatening is behind me, I actually want my higher brain to shut down. It's not the time for me in that moment to go, I wonder what happened to them in their childhood that's leading to this. Not the time for that. But often when so if I'm actually in danger, I want my higher brain to shut down. But often We are not actually in physical danger, but we still get triggered. So being in that fight or flight response is not helpful in trying to work through something with your spouse or significant other, or with your boss, or with a coworker or a contractor. And it happens a lot. So we can either go out the top into that state of hyperarousal, or some of us will go out the bottom and go into a state of hypoarousal. So whereas the top is more anxiety-like, the bottom is more of a depressive state. Hypo is going low, shutting down, going numb. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. I'm on lockdown. Whereas the top is a fight or flight response, the bottom is a freeze response. And everyone has different tendencies. So some people, if they're to leave their window, they're always going to fly out the top. Others will always go out the bottom. Some of us, we might go at the top and spin and spin and spin in our thoughts and our anxiety, and then we can't sustain that. So then we go out the bottom and shut down. Or maybe at work, you're in the hyper state, and as soon as you go home, you go into hypo. Or maybe your loved one is one extreme and you're the other. So there's all sorts of variations here. And yeah, I'm hearing from you guys that you've seen this really clearly in yourself and others and can think of textbook examples. So what I want to pause and do right now, I want to test the poll. So this system, it only let me in like 3 minutes before it started. So I want to just see if you can see where the chat is, and then there's the thing that says poll. I put 2 polls in here, and I don't think I launched it. I think it's just there and you click on it. So help me test this out. So there's 2 questions I want you to answer based on just your present knowledge from what I've shared so far. So in general, if you were to go out of your window, what is your non-window tendency at work? And then what is your non-window tendency at home? Hyper or hypo? And then let me know if for some reason you can't access that or it's not working, but I'm pretty sure you just click on the poll function. And then can someone just give me some feedback here in the chat if you can see that or if it's working or not? Oh, it is working. Okay. So I just switched it to show the results here. So you guys should be able to see this too, but what it's showing me so far is what is your non-window tendency at work? And so far with the votes, about 72% are hyper and about 27% hypo. Interesting. And then at home, 80% hyper, 18% hypo. Okay, so interesting. Obviously, this is a very small sample, but I'll, in case you're curious, I'll let you know because I teach this for a lot of companies, whether it's full companies with lots of employees or it's small leadership teams. And so I'm always kind of just collecting the results informally for my own interest. And I think the common theme is I'm working with a lot of high-performing people. That's probably the most common thread. And typically what I see overall is at work, about 80 to 90% go into that hyper state. So that's really similar to what you guys are showing. And I think that makes sense if you think about high performance or startup world. It's fast paced. We're more likely to go into that space. But what's interesting to me is the home results here. So because that's actually really similar to your non-window tendency at work. Typically what I see just across the board is that one often is closer to 50-50, which is interesting. So John, you default hyper home and work until burnout and then hypo. And I work from home as well, so maybe that's the issue. Yeah, and then we just have all these complex added layers here. So this is just to have a beginning understanding here. But what I love about this, and again, I'm going to flesh this out a little bit more, but even just what you know so far, this is going to give you a new framework and a new paradigm to understand yourself and those around you. This is actually a really simple, concrete tool to begin to have a new level of self-awareness. Because here's the thing to know about the window. If you can recognize that you're not in your window, the number one goal is to get back in. The number one goal is to get back in. Because if you try to navigate life, make decisions, work through conflict out of your window, it's only going to end poorly. Your starting point determines your end point. So I want you to think about a loved one or someone close in your life, because that's where all the stuff of life comes up the most. So think about this person and think about a time where you had to work through something tricky and difficult, and you were able to work through it even though it was hard. But on the other side of it, you felt closer and you got through it. Now think of the same person and a time where you worked through something tricky and it blew up in your face. Ever have that happen? I imagine probably at some point. Typically, the difference between those two circumstances are the time that it blew up in your face, one or both of you were not in your window. One or both of you were not in your window. So just to really hit this point home, when I was in the height of doing trauma therapy work, if someone would come into my office and work through their trauma, if they were in their window, they could actually process through the trauma, begin to get healing and move forward. But if someone was out of their window and tried to talk through their past trauma, it would actually re-imprint the trauma in the brain and make it worse. So we wouldn't do that, but that's what would happen. So that has massive implications for just all of us in our day-to-day lives. All the times we just get into the same old relational patterns again and again, and it just actually it brings deeper grooves in our neural pathways of just getting in the same unhealthy patterns. So this is why I love this framework, because the goal over time is, how do I increasingly act from intention rather than from reaction? And what's helpful here to remember is the number one goal is to get back in my window. Obviously, we don't always have the luxury or the time to do this, but it's kind of like that corny quote, reach for the moon, even if you miss, you land among the stars. Just having this as your target means you're going to get so much closer. So our goal is to get back in your window. The other thing to remember here is, if you can recognize that you're not in your window, as much as possible, you don't want to make major decisions or come to conclusions about yourself or others. Again, because it will only end poorly. Because literally, you cannot access the higher brain part of your brain. You're in a shutdown mode. It's kind of like with little kids when it's way past their bedtime and you're like, okay, it's time for bed. And they're like, but I'm not tired. And you can see clearly that they're tired. It's kind of like that when we're not in our window. We actually can't fully recognize how outside we are in the moment. So again, this is building baby steps. This is mental strength training over time of beginning to incrementally expand our awareness. So if I can recognize that I'm not in there, I'm purposing over time to not make major life decisions and to not come to conclusions. So what do I mean by don't come to conclusions? If you were to picture your inner world like your thought life, your emotional life, like a home, and suddenly all these negative thoughts are knocking on your door, all these insecurities and fears and the catastrophic thinking and what if. This is recognizing that if I'm not in my window, I might see that these things are all knocking, but I actually don't have to let them into my house. I don't have to invite them in for tea. I'm actually just suspending them in animation. So when I was in school growing up, we would always have a fire safety unit, and they would teach us this certain phrase to remember if there was a fire, if we smelled smoke or something like that. And if some of you know this, feel free to drop it in the chat. But basically what they told us was stop, drop, and roll. Stop, drop, and roll. And this is what I think of. I'm going to really focus on the hyper here, since the majority, that's your tendency. But like, if I'm spinning up in my thoughts, it's not the time to engage in them. It's almost like an active battlefield. So if you picture an active battlefield, and if that's what it's going to be like in my mind, It's not the time for me to casually saunter through the battlefield. It's the time for an army crawl. It's the time to get low, to go to the bottom. And I'm going to explain more what I mean by that here. So I'm going to draw over this to save time here and just draw another blue triangle. So this blue triangle is representing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm guessing at some point, most of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy, but really quickly, it's this theory of human development that basically everybody has to start with getting their basic needs met at the bottom. So food, shelter, safety. Actually, safety is the second. Once we have the basic needs, then we worry about our safety. Then we worry about belonging. I can't worry about my belonging if my basic needs aren't met. Then we have our esteem, our self-esteem as a human. And at the very top is self-actualization. That's typically described as finding your higher purpose in life. Or sometimes Mother Teresa is used as an example, like caring for the orphans or doing something beyond yourself. The reason that I want to bring up this theory is if you're not in your window, it's not the time to self-actualize, or it's not the time to measure how well you're doing on that. Yet often we feel compelled to. We just want symptom relief when we're in that hyper state. Like, I just gotta respond to that email. I just gotta do this. When actually it's not the time to, because we literally can't access the higher part of our brain. It's not the time to judge things when you're not in your window. It's actually the time to go to the bottom, get low to the ground, focus on your basic needs, the very basic needs. I'm going to go more into that, but I just want to leave that here for a second. And what I want to do real quick, as I was sharing this, I was just thinking, I want to share with you this other big concept, and this is probably one I refer to 10 times a day, 5 times a session, I don't know, a lot. And basically, it's this concept that all of our strengths become a weakness without a healthy boundary to protect them. All of our strengths become a weakness without a healthy boundary to protect them. So it's not that something is wrong with us. It's that what's really right about us and our strengths, if they don't have a cap on them, they run amok in our lives. As an example, a fire loose in a home is destructive. That doesn't mean that fire is bad. That same fire in the confines of the fireplace means we get to enjoy its warmth and it provides a cozy atmosphere. So you each have many strengths. And I would actually guess that one of them that would be true for a lot of you is you're probably good at problem solving and analyzing. That is great if you're in your window, but it will not be helpful outside of your window. It's like that fire. It will actually burn things up. It will burn you and those around you if you're trying to solve it through your brain when you're actually only accessing a survival state in your brain. So the way back is not thinking your way through it, actually, once we pass that tipping point outside of our window. I want to share this quick paraphrase story, and probably some of you have heard this before. It's the story of the two wolves, and how I've heard it told is the story of this Native American grandfather and his grandson, and they're sitting around a campfire, and the grandfather's telling the story of two wolves, and one wolf represents good, the other represents evil. And the grandson says, "Grandfather, which wolf wins? Which wolf do you think wins?" I hope good does, but what the grandfather says to his grandson is, "Whichever wolf you feed wins." Whatever we feed wins. When we feed negative, anxious thoughts, they grow and grow and become big. When we feed positive, helpful, productive thoughts, those grow and become big. So the goal over time is, with intention, to starve out the programming that's come from early in life that is not helpful, and to begin to allow new pathways to form and strengthen around helpful, productive thoughts. And the other thing I want to let you guys know here, if you've never heard this in your life, I want to tell you something pretty cool. And it's this: you don't have to think everything that you think. You don't have to think everything that you think. just because a thought flies into your mind doesn't mean you have to think it. You actually can choose whether to let it float past or whether to feed it and watch it grow. So this is massive. Okay. Yeah, our thoughts are not necessarily true. I'm just catching up here in some of the comments. Yeah, so as we're growing in this awareness, the skill that we're developing, and I'm going to actually type it here in the chat, is called self-attunement. So self-attunement is very similar to the concept of mindfulness, which I'm sure you've heard of, self-awareness. It's probably a little bit more of a therapeutic spin on the language. But what that means is I'm growing in my ability to attune to what's happening on the inside. I'm just becoming a curious student of my insides. But the key here is that it's from a kind and non-judgmental stance towards myself. Because as soon as you start judging yourself, you actually take yourself out of your window. So we're just beginning to be curious and notice. It might go like this. You learn about this window, you go about your business, and then later today maybe, or tomorrow, you find yourself in a situation that tends to trigger you outside of your window. You still get triggered, you react, let's say, and then later that evening, you have some time to think and you're like, wow, that Meredith talked about the window. I was not in my window. That's progress. Then maybe the next time you get in the situation again and you find yourself reacting and you have just this mini second of recognizing, I don't think I'm in my window right now. You still have no idea what to do instead. You still react out of the same patterns, but you just made progress. And these little things are actually massive. It's kind of like if you think about a ship in the ocean and the captain is at the helm and they're going one direction, and then someone just moves the compass or whatever it's called 1 little degree over. And it's like, how big of a difference can that little bit make? Over the course of the ocean, these micro shifts massively shift your trajectory. So this is just micro shifts over time that begin to shift. And it's actually building new neural pathways in your brain. So if our old common reactions are very deeply ingrained grooves that we just fall in every time and go down that same path, this is, again, kind of like the pioneering thing, taking a machete to the jungle in our brain right next door and beginning to carve out a new path. And it's tricky at first, but over time, that becomes a well-worn path, and we're actually building that strength. I said before, mental strength training. So it's really obvious in person if someone works out a lot or if someone has skipped leg day. But what's not as obvious on the outside, if someone has done the mental strength training, you can actually become buff in your brain. Like, we actually have the capacity to build and grow these patterns of emotional intelligence and awareness of ourselves and others. But it's just baby steps over time. So I want to share one other thing here that relates to this, because I'm curious if this relates to you guys. A lot of the people that I work with struggle being kind to themselves. And when I talk about that, it's just not a nice sentiment. It's actually neurologically the quickest way to move forward. So I want to explain something here, and I want to first talk about healthy parenting to get to where I want to go. So healthy parenting is a combination of high warmth and nurture and high structure and expectations. So if there's a parent and they parent all, and they're all about the rules and structure and expectations, but there's no love, no warmth, it's not good for kids. Alternatively, if it's all warm and soft, but there's no structure and expectations, it's also not good. We need the both and. The same is true in managing people and teams. Obviously, in business, there's bottom lines and there's expectations. But if you don't feel cared about, or the people working for you don't feel like they matter, they won't stay long term. So those are just good things to keep in mind in general. But the reason that I bring this up is to apply it to your relationship with yourself, the way that you lead yourself, self-leadership. Most people don't even recognize that they have a relationship with themselves, but we do. Once you get your prefrontal cortex, you actually become, and maybe even earlier, but once you become an adult, you actually become the primary caregiver of yourself. We don't always recognize that. And maybe you've learned to care for your physical needs, but how are you with your emotional needs? And it actually does matter, because you can get so far cracking the whip on yourself, but eventually you hit a ceiling. That's actually what I work a lot with the CEOs and founders that I work with, is they get so far based on their ability, and then they hit a ceiling, a mental block of some sort of insecurity or being negative to themselves, and they can't push past it. They can't go to the next level. But here's the thing, as you grow in awareness and you recognize what was a ceiling, as you learn to overcome that ceiling, what used to be a ceiling is your new floor. It's actually your new foundation. So just as an example, actually I wasn't planning to share this stuff, it's just coming out, but when I closed my therapy practice and I took a sabbatical before starting this business, I remember like it was in my heart to build this, but I didn't want to do speaking. Like I didn't want to be in front of people. My strength, so back to the strength become a weakness, my strength as a therapist of being high in empathy and intuition and caring about people, that's a great strength. But if that strength goes outside of the healthy boundary, that can go into people pleasing or not wanting to offend someone. And so I just remember having that ceiling of, I don't want to be out there. I don't want people to have opinions. I don't want to put stuff up and unknowingly offend someone, because that's the farthest from what I would ever want to do, caring about people's feelings. But I had to recognize that was a ceiling keeping me going forward. So as I intentionally broke through that ceiling, that actually gave me a new floor. Like, that's not an issue anymore. It doesn't mean it's never going to be an area that I have to keep growing and refining, but I busted through a ceiling, and that ceiling is my new floor. And when I did that, it meant I have a whole new room of possibilities. I have so many more directions and opportunities that I can go in my life, because I'm not holding myself back at this place. So this is the benefit of growing in self-awareness. It helps you take no matter what comes your way, and it helps it be a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. And I remember during when COVID was hitting, in the beginning intensity, it's still intense, but like when it was still new and intense, and through that first winter and stuff, it was just so shocking to see so many clients say, like, I know that this is such a terrible time, but I'm actually the most clear and the healthiest that I've ever been. Like, they were able to learn how to leverage the time to move them forward. And this is the beautiful thing and the key thing of being a pioneer and a waymaker, to build this foundation of self-awareness. So all this being said, do you want to know how to get back in your window? Anyone want to know how you get back in your window? Then you can buy my product. That's totally a joke, but I guess not funny. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how to get back in your window. And again, this is, though, in all seriousness, this is a mini version, so I'm giving you everything you need, but I mean, it takes a while to really have this sink in personally and flesh it out for you, but I want to give you like the key to this. So the key to getting back in your window starts with another corny quote. So at least the way that I would share this. So the quote goes like this, and some of you have, I'm sure, heard this. Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. Yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. So most of us, we either get stuck in the past, and that tends to be connected to the hypo more in general, feeling the depressed about what was and what isn't anymore, or something like that. Or we get anxious about the future, more the hyper arousal in general, when all the while the gift is in the present. So a time when you felt fully alive and connected to yourself, that's a time when you're in the present moment. The goal is to be present. And this is key, especially for high performer Waymaker, futuristic types, because you're always building and moving toward a target. And we have to learn how to hold the both and of moving towards and at the same time appreciating where we are in our present state in our developmental process. It's both and. You don't give birth to a full-grown adult. You give birth to a baby. We always start with something in infant form and we steward its development over time. So it's key that when we're not there fully yet, we can be excited what we're moving towards and at the same time appreciate the present. So the present moment is the key to get back into your window. And your body, your physical body, is the key to the present. So if I'm spinning in my thoughts and I'm up in that hyper state, I'm not connected to my body. I'm not even aware of what's happening with my body. So back to the Maslow's hierarchy, that's that basic needs. Have you eaten? Have you slept? The most basic things, which are usually the first to go. When we're intelligent, wise people, problem solvers, we usually think that stuff is excess when it's actually vital, especially when we're out of our window. So your physical body is the key to get back in your window via the 5 senses. So what I want to quickly go through, I want to talk about each of the 5 senses and just give you examples of strategies. So everyone's different. What's going to work for you won't be the same for the next person. And it's different if you're only a tiny bit out of your window or you've been out of it for months. But just to get you starting to think about this. And as I'm talking, if you think of other strategies that you know work, feel free to add them to the chat and we can kind of have this collective brainstorming happening. So visual. This is a huge sense to help you get back into the present moment. Being surrounded by beauty, like being outside in nature, taking in something that you just like looking at, where you just take it in and you just feel overcome. You're part of something greater, not just staring at your screen through all of COVID and that's your whole world. We're looking at something that's appealing or beautiful. So even if you work in a cubicle or at your desk all day, having something that's in your power to control, like having an image of something that you like, or it could be on your phone, having a save folder of funny videos or photos of a cute baby or your cat or dog. Basically, but when you look at that image, of that cute baby, you don't have to think your way into feeling joy. It's an automatic physiological response that just happens. Or you watch that funny comedian and it completely shifts your brain state. That's massive. It's kind of like when I have a billion tabs open on my Mac and it's just stuck at some point. I have to reboot my computer. It's the same thing here when we're out of our window. We can't think our way back in. We have to shift our brain state. So that's something that you could do if you have a presentation you're anxious about or something. You can actually watch something funny or have these images on your phone or something that helps shift your brain state. It's not something that you have to think your way into shifting. You just look at it and it's an automatic physiological shift. So the next sense I want to talk about is a physical touch, or the kinesthetic one. All body movement, exercise is massive. Any movement helps us get back into our body, or your bottom. Sitting on your bottom, being firmly planted in the room, that's huge. Anything with temperature, so hot and cold, like I'm a big proponent of the sauna and the cold tub. All of those are things that bring us into our body, into the present moment. And I want to teach you guys a quick technique here. If you're able to hook your thumbs, I'm just going to trust you're doing this with me, but hook your thumbs, put your hands on your chest, and then slowly back and forth, tap one at a time. This is a technique known as butterfly tapping, but this is something that will automatically begin to calm your physiology. Similar, breathing is massive, intentional breathing, there's tons of strategies, but what's at play with this is something known as bilateral stimulation. So the back and forth between right and left. That's a process at play that's similar to what's happening during REM sleep when your eyes are darting back and forth. Or this is also an added benefit for a lot of runners, aside from the endorphins and other things. Often when runners are running, their arms are going back and forth, and it's actually doing that bilateral stimulation movement. And what's happening is it's helping take the thing stuck in the emotional part of our brain and process it through logic and reason. It's not just stuck and flushed in the emotional part. It's being able to move through. So butterfly tapping is a good one. If you're not in a place where you feel like you can just do that straight up in a meeting, more power to you if you do it anyway. But what you can also do is firmly plant your feet on the ground. Notice that you're on the ground, and then slowly and with intention tap your feet back and forth, back and forth. That's something you can easily do at the doctor's office or in a board meeting or something. And that will begin to bring calming. If you think and oppose that with restless leg, that's like a hyper thing. Instead, intentional, slow, back and forth. The sense of smell, essential oils are big. We would use that in the trauma therapy room a lot if someone was starting to go out of their window. Something like lavender is calming and brings you back down. But if you're low in a hypo state, something energizing like peppermint or orange will bring you back up. What else? Music. So that one, thinking about calming music to bring you back down, energizing music to bring you up. The sense of taste, even just being intentional when you eat, is huge, rather than just eating quickly while you do other stuff or not eating. Brushing your teeth at some point midway through the day, having a peppermint. These are all ways that you can leverage the 5 senses to get back present. Because if you actually spend the extra time to get present, you can do way more from inside this. I'm gonna tell you guys another quick story, but I want to let you know I'm gonna start opening things up for questions. So if you have questions, because there's a little lag when you type in when I see them, feel free to start typing in questions if you have them. And if you want to do it in an audio way, we can also figure that out too. But if you have questions, you can start to put them in the chat. So I want to tell you this other quick story. I told you about the 2 wolves. This is about the 2 woodcutters. The story of the 2 woodcutters, and this is just a brief paraphrase, but there are these 2 woodcutters who are going to have a tree chopping competition. One is this older experienced man, and the other is this fresh young guy who's raring to go and is muscly and ready to win. And so they start the day, they're chopping away. After a while, the older experienced man pauses, sits down, takes a break, and invites the younger guy to join him. He's like, no way, I don't have time for that. I'm younger than you. I'm stronger. I'm going to beat you. I'm not going to waste time. So he just keeps chopping away, seeing the trees come down. Basically, this cycle repeats several times. And at the very end of the day, they stop, they compare who chopped more trees. And to the younger, stronger, unceasing guy's amazement, the older gentleman who just kept taking breaks throughout had chopped a significantly more amount of trees. And he was like, how is this even possible? I never ceased, and I'm stronger, and I kept chopping. Any of you know? Basically, what he said to him was, every time I was sitting down to rest, I was sharpening my axe. So that's the moral of the story. You can chop way more trees with a sharpened blade than nonstop chopping away with a dull blade. And yet we try to do that all the time in hustle culture, just trying to get through. You can actually do more by pulling back and sharpening your axe. So this is just beginning steps. This is just learning about this will shift things for you, but this at the same time is mental strength training. These are skills that we grow and build over time. Okay, do you have any book author suggestions for more in-depth look at relevant source material? Yeah, I'm pulling from a lot of stuff here. So first, I'll tell you my personal resources and then just a couple other things. One, Daniel Siegel is the neurobiologist that the window of tolerance is his. So he has it in like a bunch of random, very long, lengthy books, and they're all pretty good. But that's someone that you can look up to learn more about the window in general. And I'm kind of using that in like just tons of years of stuff and smatterings, but that's one thing. In terms of like how I bring the concepts together and the work, so a couple things. One, I post tons of stuff on Instagram, the @scalingwithin. That's a way that you can do that. I have a weekly email called Your Mini Dose of Inner Growth. I'm not a spammer. I'm not into mass marketing emails, but I do like a little quick weekly email with a little thought of this, so it helps build that over time. And then let me go back to this other question here. Can you reiterate how you overcame the fear, reluctance of offending people and caring so much about people pleasing? Great question. I don't think I really went into the depth of how I did that. And I don't even, at some point I should probably figure out how did I do that. I think, so first of all, I don't have some clear 5-point answer. That would actually make a good little, that would be good to figure out the steps. But I think step one is just beginning to recognize it. To begin to have it as a target is, oh, this is a current ceiling of mine. This is something that I'm going to begin to address and look at.